You're listening to Radio 1 on AM, FM and on the web. The documentary on One this week is A Return to Silence. Taking part are Mary O'Malley, Theo Dorgan, Brendan Kenneally and John Moriarty. The programme is introduced by Colin Morrison.
Suggest in our modern cosmology that the universe had origin in a big bang. The Lord save us, what a horror story that is, like, you know. And I suppose that cosmology could only be born out of our noise world, you know.
A pale white woman, thin as a sea mist, fragile as a moonflower, walks through the hills, leaving stillness as she goes. And like the ancients, follows a half-forgotten tune to the dim distance of a far frontier. While my pilgrim of the heart, the prophet of the unknown, motionless under the crag, motionless under a swill of willows, returns yet again to silence.
The human heart, the human mind, has always had, I suppose, an uncomfortable, an uneasy relationship with silence. On the one hand, there is a longing, a yearning almost, while on the other, there can be a real fear, a real terror. Do we, I wonder, like Eliot, constantly distract ourselves from distraction, by distraction? Well, maybe we do. And how, if we wish, in this modern age, can we return yet again to silence?
Hindus say that in the beginning was the silence, you know, and then a sound, a vibration, they call it the Om sound, emerged out of the silence. Now, that wasn't the sound of any two things striking together. There were no two things at that time. There was only the one thing. So that was a metaphysical sound emerging out of the silence. And the whole universe is a blossoming of that sound. The whole universe is, even the galaxies, they are an elaboration, a cosmological elaboration of that first sound.
I suppose I dream about silence. Most writers do. I suspect every writer has a sense of an ideal silence out of which real thought might be possible, but there is no such thing. I don't think I've ever in my life encountered silence. Nothing is ever still on this planet. You know, there's always somewhere, no matter how still the afternoon on the side of a mountain is, or in the top of a high-rise block, there's still a faint hum of traffic, or the river, or the sea, or a bee going by somewhere minding its own business. So I suppose from a writer's point of view, silence is an absolute metaphor. It's a metaphor like darkness. There's no true darkness, perhaps. I mean, we know intellectually, we know experientially now, such as the times we live in, that there is possibly silence in space. But I don't think we can talk about silence in any meaningful way. And that's the booming, buzzing confusion of the planet we live on.
Well, I suppose I'd never thought about it. So I went to the dictionary, like all very dependent people. And I got almost very short definitions, very little to say on it, the dictionary has. But the most interesting translation I came across was that one of the Irish dictionaries defined the command to be silent as éist, or éistige, in other words, to listen. And I thought that was interesting.
To sit alone in a room, turn off the radio, turn off the television, turn off the light, to sit in the darkness of a room, to sit in your own darkness and in your own silence, to let things erupt, dreams, relationships that failed, to let that space recreate the drama that is your life and is not going to remain buried in you, but by the grace of silence is allowed to live again. That is something that I'm intensely grateful for.
I don't think it's the absence of sound. I mean, I think someone who can be stone deaf might not be experiencing silence. You could be experiencing agitation, anxiety inside of your own life, inside of your own growing and not growing. I think there's a kind of sound that is silence. It is born in silence, and sometimes you're sitting in the silence, and it requires a sound to come in to make you aware of the silence.
I've had a number of times in my life where, in the middle of an absolutely chaotic street, trucks and guards and pedestrians and hop-a-me-toms and all sorts of curious people screaming and roaring and shouting and buzzing and booming, and suddenly, as if your ears pop, there's a moment of what feels like complete silence. And that's generally, it's just kind of, these revelatory moments can be revelations of the banal. It can be something perfectly ordinary, but what interests me about those occasional moments of silence is the buoyancy after. That's as if silence is a bubble that expands in the spirit and lifts you just slightly for a moment into another world.
I think of silence, I suppose, as being what happens when you're not talking. When you have room to hear all the other sounds sometimes, and mostly just huge activity going on in your head. If I was a Buddhist or a sort of developed and evolved person, I'm sure I wouldn't be hearing much at all. But especially when you're writing, or say trying to write, there's a constant, maybe it may not be a dialogue, or it may indeed even be a crowd, but there's something always going on. And I suppose for writers, a lot of that is word connected, even if you're not actually speaking.
One of the most interesting forms of silence is the silence of time. The strange thing about history, if you really sit back in that chair in the darkness with the telly and the radio off, is that it's waiting to live. Again, it's the act of attention, the creation of space, and the gift of silence to allow history to relive in you, your own personal history. Go back over the number of years that you can recall. And then, of course, the history of one's country, the history of one's continent, the history of the world, the history of people.
But it's interesting that people aspire towards silence, I suppose. When silence has so many connotations. In day-to-day life, there's negative silence, there's the threatened right to silence if the last vestiges of democracy crumble around us. But I suppose silence at its purest is a state of, it's a metaphor and the ground for a condition of oneness with things. Oneness with ourselves. Silence is often a synonym for peace, isn't it?
My father used to go over in the night. I remember he'd go over to the stall, an old pre-EEC stall, one of the old stalls of Ireland, cow stalls of Ireland. And having fed his cows, he'd sit in a three-legged stool behind them, and he'd listen to the cows chewing the cud, or he'd listen to them eating the hay. And in his own phrase, he'd be ex-muinavus a machn of them féin. He'd be thinking and contemplating to himself. And I think the sound of the cows chewing the cud, that was silence, and he would have experienced it as silence.
But I think of silence more as being framed by the sounds that are there. Almost like a picture, that it's defined to some extent by whatever breaks it, whatever non-verbal sounds happen, And also I think silence just is a multi-textured thing.
Yet I'm not sure that it would be a healthy condition to be left in for too long. I think of people in who lead isolated lives deep in the countryside and how they go crazy for the sound of a human voice. Here on Macmahuna recently, somebody was reciting The Old Woman of the Roads. And I remember as a child thinking, but God, she'll be so lonesome. Because the whole thrust of the poem is not, to me, even as a child I felt this, it's not about having the little house, the delf, the stool and all. It's been out of the winds keen and roar in a silent place, except maybe for the ticking of Seamus Heaney's aunt's clock. But then I thought, silence, solitariness. And I remember as a child thinking that would be terrible. And I still think that too much of it would be bad for you. Maybe silence is reality. In Eliot's sense that mankind can bear but a little reality.
But then I remember one day living at the edge of a lake, as I did in Connemara, and that was a lake. It was a tidal pool as much as it was a lake. The seals would come up and I'd see great big rings around there, and I'd hear the salmon jumping. Then one day a neighbour turned on an engine in that lake, a boat engine, and off he went. And I felt that the gods disappeared. The gods of the lake, the spirits of the lake left the moment that engine noise appeared or was heard. I can imagine the silence of woods that I've been in and bring a chainsaw into that, and then also the divinity's gone. You know, you've destroyed something forever, I think. I mean, the wood has been hugely damaged.
In that space, silence becomes a tribunal. It becomes a court where there are judges and accused, defense attorneys, and attorneys on behalf of the state. And it's interesting to allow that tribunal to happen in one's own silence, to allow all the different voices that thrive within us and which all go to form our own single voice, to allow them to exist.
We all know that extraordinary sensation of when you're sort of taken out of the city for a couple of days, and there's the time when you wake up in the middle of the night and you're disoriented, you're completely disoriented, because that small but ever-present orchestration of night zones in a city is missing. No sirens have gone by, a door hasn't clicked somewhere in a corridor below in the square. Nobody has rattled a can along the railings of the estate. And the disorientation and the fear, I suppose, that comes in.
I walk here every day and I will think things out, or often maybe step things out, because you do rhythmically. If you're working on a very rhythmical piece, you know, if you're done, I don't know, syllabically sort of measured poems, say, you'd find yourself somewhat walking it out. You know, Yeats knew a thing or two about that. But also, I suppose, I think a lot of people think of silence and stillness, but I actually think of silence and walking.
I think that the fear of silence has to do with the fear of who one is. Because if you encounter and explore your own silence, you just come up against all your limitations, all your failures. But I think that's a very wealthy, enriching thing to do.
I grew up in a house without radio or television, and there was one night when Jimmy Kassan, who was an all-night walker, used to come in, and he looked at my shoe and decided my shoe needed a half sole, and he said to me, go down and get the last and get the hammer and the tack and the strip of leather from the dresser. And I was on the way when I heard my mother saying, Faith, you will not do it, because, and she pointed to a hen that was hatching under the table, under the small table, and she said, that hen is sitting on her 12 eggs, and if you start hammering now, you might even kill the chicks in the eggs. And I remember 3 days later, Chris, my brother, was outside, and he was mending a bit of corrugated iron on the hay shed, and he was hammering, and my mother went to the door and commanded him to stop that, so in our house, the metallurgical ages had to take second place to a hatching hen, you know. And that I find to have grown up in that meant that I was ever afterwards unable for the noise of the modern world, and have been escaping from the noise of the modern world.
If you think of it, logically or reasonably, we spend far more of our time in silence than we do in noise. I mean, that sounds a paradox, but I mean, as uttering creatures, if you were to take all the noise that a person makes in the course of a day, singing, shouting, making love, gargling, demanding tea, cursing the bus that's just gone past full, whatever. And if you just taped it all and spliced it together, removing the silences, I wonder what portion of a 24-hour day you'd have. But I mean, that's really only, I suppose, applicable to speech, because in the most silent, reflective, calm, meditative, contemplative frame of mind you are, you're still belching and your blood is still gurgling over the promontories on the wrist, and the tides are still washing in and out of you. That's why I said that I'm very dubious about even the possibility of silence.
I called my own selected poems A Time for Voices, and I know I had silence in mind. The silence of memory. The silence that lets images live again. So I would say that silence is a challenge. It's a problem. It's an emptiness in which self-revelation is possible. It is a comment on the inadequacy of language, the failure of words, even as it establishes its own subtle and powerful eloquence in your heart and mind.
If you ever had any doubt as to whether silence was tangible, actually, you just have to walk into a room where a couple's just had a row. or the opposite, actually, as well. I think perhaps the most eloquent silences of all are those between couples, or maybe between parents and kids as well. Silence, I suppose, one of the deadest things ever on earth can be a silence in a relationship, if it's a kind of final dead silence. And one of the most wonderful things is the silence in a good relationship, or at a good time in a relationship. Kind of fruitful, easy, completely, because there's no need to say anything, because things are understood and allowed, as opposed to because there's nothing to say.
Sometimes you walk into a house and into a marriage, and you experience a Berlin Wall inside of the house, where people and the Berlin Wall is separating the husband from the wife, and maybe separating the children from each other. And people need that, because what we need inside of a relationship is space above all. And most modern houses aren't designed to help marriage.
The rarest thing, probably, in human experience is communal silence. The shared silence. What John Donne, when love with one another so inanimates two souls. Absolutely certain that the moments when that happens, it happens in absolute silence. You end up breathing the other person's breath. Those moments, I think, I think they're the key moments that we deduce human identity from. No one can guess at what the human is from their own personal experience. It's the trap that ascetics and solitary mystics, I think, fall into.
If I were to design a house that would help a marriage, there would be in the house places where people could find solitude. There would be a den for the man, a study for the woman, or a den for the woman, and for the children. Now, supposing we were wealthy enough to have such a house, and when someone went into their den or went into their study, that person wasn't regarded as gone into a sulk. That person now needs to be alone, needs his or her space. And then there would be communal areas, places where we would meet and be a family at table or at the fire or whatever. But the modern house tends to be a box in the middle of other boxes, and it's a killer.
Silence is a state, a condition in which one can be, one can fully exist in solitude and not be interrupted or violated by insistent external voices. Silence is the breathing of your spirit. Silence is all the lovely voices in the house of dreams. Silence is also where you put yourself on trial. I think silence is one of God's most interesting ways of letting us know ourselves just a little.
I think to my own childhood, when I was an altar boy, for instance, in a convent in Cork, and I loved the silence of the church when there was nobody about, and I used to get extremely irritated if anybody else came in. But then that was to do with space, far more space than you have in the average family home. It's space, it's polished wood, it's light, it's the smells, it's the coolness in summer, the warmth in winter. But that big sense of cavernous volume of silence, that was a great attraction to me. So I think that probably by virtue of communal living, the different religions have always managed to annex or to create volumes of space in which silence can come to grow. I think probably the contemplative gift, and I think it is a gift. I think the contemplative gift is probably undervalued in contemporary life, right across the spectrum, including the religious spectrum.
I spent a year with the Discalced Carmelites in Oxford. They allowed me to live with them as a layman. And I was all for silence and contemplation then, and I couldn't understand why we would do this chanting, this Gregorian chanting back and forth before we went into meditation. And of course I discovered that that quarter of an hour was hugely important. That was the doorway into the silence. The Gregorian chant, that particular kind of sound, almost was the sacrament that brought us in to the silence that would then happen and continue to happen for an hour. So silence is a state of mind. When I experience silence, when I'm sitting here, and there are nights like maybe when a fog would be down and you would go out and you would see no light and you would have no evidence at all that there is a world out there. And you would come in then, and maybe if I played a bit of Gregorian chant and I hear the sound, then the sound and the silence are one thing. They are made of the one thing. When you hear beautiful music, you know that it's born out of silence. You know that it is silence. You know the tranquility in it. And you could almost say to a piece of music, into the hands I commend my spirit. You so trust the music that in the way that you'd give yourself to a river and say, yes, this river is going to take me home. If you're in a boat or whatever, you ship out and say, the river will take me home. You give yourself to the sound, and it is a beautiful sound, and it doesn't disturb the silence.
A lot of my time alone is spent in the house. I will often create a wall of sound with music, and that's not to put down the music, but the kind of music that allows me to practically to ignore it, but it's there, I'm attentive, I'm aware of it, but it's not sapping my energy in any way. But maybe music allows you to, or in my case I should say, somehow the rhythms of the particular piece of music set the pace somewhat and put some sort of shape on the chaos that's going on, so that I can almost carve a little space out of that sound, a little niche, and work in there.
Anything that brings us to the tranquil place inside of us is silence, is a form of silence. And you will know great poetry and great music if it brings you to that silent place within you. If it doesn't, if it causes you to rave, and if it gives you these false ecstasies, then you know that it's ersatz and that it's dangerous and that it is disintegrating you. Whereas if it brings you to a place of healing, if there's, you know the medicine that's in music. If you hear the second movement of Mozart's Concerto for Flute and Harp, the moment you have those first few bars, you are in the pristine place. I don't mean pristine now in any animal sense. You are in the place. Mozart with that music brings you to the place where God said, let there be light.
Music creates the most extraordinary change in the quality, and music and its absence, what happens between the notes, what happens between, I think there in a way is the most eloquent silence of all. It's what music can do to a room, really, to the space between people, the way that it can order, maybe, and yes, order on some level always, the emotions even, marshal them, and maybe on a more intellectual level, layer the thoughts to some extent. But certainly it has the most extraordinary power to entirely almost dictate the quality of the silence that follows it.
I love the images that erupt from silence. Your father's hand, your mother's pallor, your brother's language, the ones you fight with, the sisters, the kindness of women, filling a pint for a fellow who can hardly wait to drink it, the roar of a crowd. Imagine Croke Park in your own silence. or Lansdowne Road or whatever you like. What is the roar of a crowd? Isn't it the opposite of silence? 80 or 90,000 people roaring their head off when a fella, nets the old penalty. And it's a great thing. And to understand the two things, to hear the roar in the silence, and in the middle of the roar, to appreciate your own silence,
I tell you one thing that I do associate silence with that's important to me is almost always silence is either the progenitor or the result of some impulse to bless, like Coleridge's Ancient Mariner. I blessed them unawares. It's one of those moments that gives you that steadying sense that you might not be the worst example of Homo sapiens ever to stumble about on the earth, is when you do have that impulse to bless a thing, a place, a person, and there's a silence before and a silence after. And that's a kind of a confirming silence. I think I probably am over-given to organising and administering and managing and this and speed of opinion. I think it works against the poetry. I think it works against the silence that the poems come out of. I just have to trust that I'll find the silence again.
And I sometimes imagine what would happen if we switched off every engine noise and sound in the planet. If we shut down New York, all the noise that New York makes, shut down London, shut down Tokyo, shut down Shanghai. If we just for one moment went back to the Pleistocene when there were no metals in the world. Metals weren't yet discovered. There was no minting and mining of metals, like iron hadn't yet struck upon iron. And if we just shut down all noise, all motor noises, and went back to that primordial silence, wouldn't it be wonderful?
And like most peak experiences, the near silences, the near perfect silences we experience in our lives are almost always productive of sometimes changes in the entire life, certainly a sense of steadying, of grounding of the self, and at the same time a freeing of the spirit to fly.
I think boredom is the devil's weapon, so to speak, and I think that boringness can happen while you sell out on your own silence and on your own exploration of yourself through education and thinking and through solitude and through this use of these moments when you shut out the world and allow yourself to experience the illumination of your silence, the insights that you get from yourself and from thinking about the old friends and the new friends and the troubles of the world and the injustices and trying to understand them.
There's the other sphere of silence. I mean, there are times when silence is an admirable thing. My own candid opinion is our democracy would benefit enormously if about 3/4 of our politicians were silent more often, or at least silent before they spoke, because there's a fear of that reflective pause before you say things. But the idea that public life could be conducted in part by the management of silences is not one I fear that's going to catch on in your lifetime or in mine.
There's a terrible silence, the silence of guilt. I've seen it myself. I've seen it in other people. Men sitting alone in pubs. Women too. You wish you could help.
If you go into the pubs of Ireland or into the ICA meeting rooms or whatever, anywhere in the country where people gather, in the process of a general election, people are extraordinarily vocal about what needs to be done. But there's some sort of disconnection. And I think it's the silence of despair, really, between those really passionate views about social justice and social management that people have and their expression, their conversion into the mechanisms of form and politics. And that's probably the most corrosive silence.
Literally the silence of terror, and the terror imposed by dictatorships, by governments, the fear, the policeman in the head, in Timor and wherever. And that is the darker side of silence.
There's the silence of the dispossessed, I suppose, and there's the silence of rage as well. I mean, a lot of people are driven into silence by sheer rage at the impossibility of building a perfect or even a perfectible human society. What we probably don't get enough of in contemporary politics is the silence of contempt. And I think that in common with all of the other democracies, developed, underdeveloped and semi-developed, we have a number of contemptible politicians. We have a lot of liars in politics, just as we have in poetry and in hurling. And I'm not sure whether the silence of contempt or roars of rage is the best way to deal with them. I really don't. What do you do when, say, the budget is silent on the subject of childcare?
I think it's almost like a prayer. That if it's possible to say a prayer, if it's possible really to say a prayer, because you lose attention after about 3 words, I do anyway, if I ever try to say a prayer. And if you could say it right, you'd feel you were communing, you feel you were relating to a spirit, to some strength, to some old source, call it what you like.
Well, one of the minor disappointments in my life is when somebody says something extraordinarily foolish or mean or miserable, and I think I'm looking at them in silent disdain. The bloody fool thinks that I just have nothing to say, so you can't even use silence as a rhetorical weapon anymore.
Education is, to me, a spiritual adventure in self-discovery. And I'm talking now about literature, which is a limited part of education. But it has helped me to understand that if I can read the literatures of Europe and of the world, as well as I can in translation, that I'll understand something about the people, and therefore about myself, and therefore about my own silence.
People say that poems on the page, so if it's the marks on the white page, and that the white space around the poem matters as much as the black marks, of course it does. That's another way of saying that the silence matters as much as what is said. After all, you turn the page and the poem begins to speak in your own voice, in your own mind. There was a silence before and there's a silence after, but there's a silence between every 2 discrete sounds, so that the orchestration of silence is part of the proper business of the poet, certainly, and of the novelist, I'd imagine, certainly of the musician.
Silence it fills you with half glimpses. There are moments when you only see bits of things, and you realize you've let things pass, that you could, perhaps, had you known it at the time, you might have righted something that went wrong.
I think we long for silence. I think we long for silence in maybe a good and a bad way. The bad way is it's kind of the vertigo towards the grave, where people lurch through their lives, such as say, well, at least someday it'll all be over. I just want to get to the finishing tape before I fall down. That's kind of life lived as panic. So there's that. But then there are people, rare people, who I've met and admired enormously. Sailors, walkers, farmers, bus drivers. One bus driver who lives a life of absolute Buddha-like tranquility, driving around the hills and streets of Cork. People who have a gift for gathering silence around them, they always seem to have enough time.
During my moments of silence, I would see myself as a bit of a failure, a bit of an idiot, a bit of a fool. I would also try to see myself fairly. Have I helped students? Have I written a few poems that bring pleasure to people?
I'd like to think that the occasional moments of my life where I thought I'd maybe had learned something valuable about being human, moments that almost always came out of silence. I'd like to think there might be more of those. But I don't know whether silence produces a deeper humanity or whether a more humble sense of being human might find as an accompaniment or as a reward, perhaps greater silence.
The other thing I always think is, you're an awfully long time silent after you're dead. The one thing one is absolutely certain of, even the most optimistic of us, is we won't be talking. So what harm?
means allowing self-knowledge to exist is something that I would continue to enjoy and to face up to, and to accept its accusations, and to enjoy its limited moments of praise.
In Carlos Castaneda's books, he died last year, and is a great loss. He talks about switching off the internal dialogue, or at least his hero Don Juan speaks of switching off the internal dialogue. I think that would be wonderful. I wouldn't mind shutting up that chatterbox in my head for longer periods. And yes, all radio reviewers, I know, I am aware of what I'm saying.
I like the privileges afforded by silence. It gives us a chance to appreciate the gifts of life and to know that part of the whole delight of the thing is the transience of everything. The fact that we are passing witnesses of a miracle that never ceases. And that testimony, that witnessing, is allowed to be deeper because of these moments of silence that we permit ourselves to enjoy.
I mean, look out to the mountains around here now, and I mean, they surround us. There's a whole circle of mountains around here. It isn't a circle because a circle suggests Euclidean, but you have the silence of that mountain and the mist moving totally silently on the mountain. And yesterday evening, the mountains were blue, deep blue, and soft as rabbit fur. And there was a mist left behind on the top of the mountains and down, sometimes moving down low in the mountains, and above it then was the sky, the mist in the sky. So there was a separation between the two mists. And the mist on the mountain was, you were looking on at the first morning of the world, and it's to be like the mountain, to think like the mountain, to have a sense of that you're as permanent as the mountain. If you could take the silence of the mountain, the enduring silence of the mountain into you, then of course, like, you're becoming home to your own soul. Then you would know that you are safe, you are inwardly safe. And if we could one day make a huge act of faith, an outrageous act of faith, and say that inwardly I am safe. Human inwardness is in the long run a safe place, and if I make that act of faith, then I can be as silent as the mountain, and then it is wonderful.
In A Return to Silence, you heard Mary O'Malley, Theo Dorgan, Brendan Kenneally, and John Moriarty. The reader was Jerry McCardle. The programme was compiled, introduced, and produced by Colin Morrison.
And the sound supervision for that documentary was by Mark McGrath.